What if a lifelong journey from a shepherd boy born into hardship to this global figure dominating headlines for decades was built on a really complex mix? Shrewd politics, yes, but also brutal repression, surprising social reforms, and, well, deeply personal motivations. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of the 20th century's most polarizing, most controversial leaders, Saddam Hussein.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack there.
Definitely. We're going to look at his, humble origins, his pretty dramatic rise to power, some significant domestic changes he actually ushered in, some quite surprising, and then, of course, his turbulent foreign policy that really reshaped the Middle East.
Yeah, we'll dig into how he consolidated power, those devastating wars he waged, and then obviously his downfall, the trial and execution.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from the material we've looked at. We want to help you quickly get informed about this figure whose legacy is, let's face it, still hotly debated.
You'll hear some surprising facts, I think, and hopefully just enough context to understand what shaped his era and, his lasting impact.
Okay, then let's unpack this. Where do we start? His beginnings.
Yeah, let's start right at the beginning. Saddam Hussein was born April 28, 1937, in a small village near Tikrit. And his start in life was, well, incredibly difficult.
How so?
Well, for starters, his father died before he was even born. His mother, Suha, was apparently so distraught she attempted suicide, even tried to abort the pregnancy. It's a really dark beginning.
Wow, that was intense.
It is. He was taken in by an uncle for a while, but when he went back to his mother, his stepfather, Ibrahim al-Hassan, treated him very harshly. Reports say he beat him regularly.
That's a truly rough start. Certainly not what you'd picture for someone who became such a dominant figure later on.
Not at all. So around age 10, he actually fled his family. He moved to Baghdad to live with another uncle, Khairul Talfa.
Okay, and this Uncle Telfa, what role did he play? He seems pretty important.
Hugely important. Talfa became a real father figure to Saddam. He was a devout Sunni Muslim, a veteran of the 1941 Anglo-Iraqi War. And crucially, he mentored Saddam. He's the one who introduced him to the revolutionary Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party back in 1957.
Right, the Ba'ath Party. And for you listening, it's worth remembering this was a nationalist, socialist, kind of secular party pushing for Arab unity.
Exactly, a major force in the region at the time.
And Saddam really bought into this ideology, didn't he? I think he even dropped out of law school to, dedicate himself to the party cause.
He did, and beyond his uncle's direct influence, you have to remember the broader context. The rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was a massive influence on young Ba'athists like Saddam.
Nasser fighting the British and French in the Suez Crisis, trying to modernize Egypt, that really lit a fire, right?
Absolutely. It inspired this whole wave of revolutions across the Middle East in the 50s and 60s. You saw monarchies falling in Iraq, Egypt, Libya, all driven by this powerful current of Pan-Arabism.
So Saddam's steeped in this revolutionary thinking. How does he go from being an activist to actually shaping Iraq's future? What's his first big, maybe controversial moment?
Well, his ascent really kicked off with literally a bang, or maybe more accurately, a premature shot. In 1959, the Ba'ath Party plotted to assassinate Abdul Karim Qasim.
He was Iraq's leader then, right? More of an Iraq-first guy, not so keen on Pan-Arabism.
Exactly. Saddam was part of the assassination team, but he was meant to just provide cover. Instead, he apparently fired too early, kind of messed up the whole operation.
And Qasim survived. So this failed attempt, it actually helped Saddam. Seems counterintuitive.
It really does. But it paradoxically gave Saddam and the Ba'ath Party huge exposure. It became a crucial part of his public image, part of his self-mythologizing later on.
And there are whispers, aren't there, about outside involvement, CIA, Egyptian intelligence.
Yeah, that's what makes it really fascinating. Some reports, citing former U.S. officials, suggest they might have had a hand in it. It turns this botched attempt into potentially political theater with global undertones. Whether true or not, it adds another layer.
Okay, so after this failed plot, he escapes to Cairo.
Right. And while there, he actually secures a seat in the Iraqi Ba'ath leadership. But here's a key point. Unlike a lot of others who fled or stayed away, he chose to go back to Iraq after an anti-Ba'athist purge in 1963.
That must have been incredibly risky.
Hugely risky. And sure enough, he was arrested and imprisoned from 1964 to 1966.
But he escaped, right? And that time in prison, his return, it seems like that really cemented his position somehow.
It did. When he got back, he played a key role in rebuilding the Ba'ath Party. And crucially, he created this Ba'athist security service, the Jihaz al-Qaz, which he alone controlled. That was a massive step in building his own internal power base.
Okay, building his power base. Then comes the 1968 coup, the 17 July Revolution.
Yes, he participated in that bloodless coup led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, which overthrew Abdurrahman Arif. Now, his official role was probably exaggerated later.
As often happens.
Exactly. But the sources do highlight his meticulous planning and execution of the next crucial step, purging the non-Ba'athista elements from the new government.
He was ruthless even then. Didn't he personally escort the ousted prime minister out of the country at gunpoint?
He did, Abdurrazak Anaif. That whole experience dealing with internal party factions and potential rivals seems to have really hardened his resolve to maintain absolute power and enforce party unity. He'd seen how instability could wreck things.
Right, so that sets the stage for his time as vice president under al-Bakr from 68 to 79. And this period, it reveals a really unexpected side, doesn't it? Almost progressive.
It really does. As vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, he built this reputation as a progressive, very effective politician. And the key, oil wealth.
Ah, the oil. He oversaw the nationalization of international oil interests in 72, right? Just before the 73 energy crisis hit.
Perfect timing from his perspective. Oil prices skyrocketed and Iraq was suddenly flush with cash. He shrewdly leveraged that massive influx of revenue.
And it didn't just, stash it away. What did he do with it? How did it impact ordinary Iraqis?
He poured it into the country. A huge national infrastructure campaign. Roads, mining, industries developing, electricity reaching almost everywhere. Agriculture was mechanized, land distributed to farmers, spending on agricultural development doubled in just 1 year.
The economic growth was pretty staggering, wasn't it? By the late 70s, Iraq had a budget reserve over, $35 billion?
Incredible numbers for the time. And it wasn't just the economy. Iraq developed one of the most modern public health systems in the Middle East. Saddam actually got an award from UNESCO for improvements in literacy and healthcare.
Literacy rates went up significantly. Universal free schooling right up to the highest levels. These were genuinely progressive moves for the region back then.
Absolutely, especially when you look at women's rights during this period.
That's one of the most surprising aspects, I think. The sources say he personally championed women's emancipation.
He did. Women were strongly encouraged to get educated during the workforce. They rose to high-ranking positions in government, medicine, you name it.
And the laws backed this up. Equal pay, maternity leave.
Yes, laws guaranteeing equal pay, a full 6 months of paid maternity leave, protection against sexual harassment. These were policies that rivaled or even exceeded what was available in places like the U.S. at the time.
It's such a stark contrast to his later image.
It really is. Women got full suffrage in 1980. By the 80s, look at the numbers. 46% of teachers and dentists were women, 29% of doctors, 70% of pharmacists. It shows a real commitment to certain social reforms in that era, which often gets lost in the narrative.
Okay, so domestically, there's this surprising picture of progress. What about foreign relations during his vice presidency? He was clearly aiming for Iraq to be a major player.
Definitely. He signed that 15-year treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union in 72, though relations cooled later. He built close ties with France, too, and notably, he led the Arab opposition to the Camp David Accords.
The peace treaties between Egypt and Israel, he was firmly against those.
Very firmly. And we also have to mention the 1975 Algiers Agreement. That was a peace treaty with Iran.
Right, aimed at settling that long-running border dispute over the Shatt al-Arab waterway.
Exactly. A really crucial waterway, a flashpoint for centuries. The treaty aimed to settle borders, improve relations, and as part of the deal, the Shah of Iran withdrew support for Kurdish separatists fighting Iraq. That was a big diplomatic win for Saddam, temporarily at least.
Temporarily being the key word there.
Yeah.
So you've got this decade of, state building, economic growth, social change. You might expect a smooth transition to the presidency. But when he formally takes power in 1979, forcing al-Bakr to resign, it's anything but smooth. It gets brutal, fast.
Immediately. Almost, his first act upon formally taking power was to consolidate control in the most ruthless way possible. He convened this assembly on July 22, 1979. It was videotaped.
And what happened there?
He claimed he'd uncovered a fifth column within the Ba'ath party itself, basically, traitors working from within. Then he had a list read out. 68 names of alleged co-conspirators.
Just read out in front of everyone.
Yes. And as their names were called, they were removed one by one, taken into custody, they were tried, and 22 were ultimately executed.
And the chilling detail. High-ranking party members were forced to be the firing squad.
That's right. It sent an absolutely terrifying, undeniable message about loyalty and the price of dissent. It was a stark warning. Cross me, and this is what happens. Even your closest colleagues might be forced to kill you.
So absolute control established at the top, and that control extended downwards, didn't it? Through organizations like the Popular Army and especially the Mukhabarat.
The Mukhabarat, yes. The Department of General Intelligence. His field secret police, infamous for torture, disappearances, assassinations, they were responsible for internal security and brutal repression.
Human Rights Watch estimates, what, 250,000 to 290,000 Iraqis murdered or disappeared under his regime? The scale is just horrifying.
It's staggering. Yet it's interesting, the sources also point out some nuances. It wasn't purely terror. He also built up this extensive patronage system.
Rewarding loyalty.
Exactly, creating this web of dependence through rewards, positions, benefits for his supporters. And unlike, say, Stalin or Hitler, where leaving was almost impossible, over 1 million Iraqis actually migrated out of the country during his rule. And religious freedom. Well, it was monitored, but it wasn't completely stamped out.
So it wasn't a purely totalitarian state in the strictest sense, maybe? There were escape valves, ways to survive or even benefit if you played the game?
It suggests perhaps a more pragmatic, still utterly brutal approach to control. Blending the stick, the extreme violence and fear with the carrot, the incentives and a degree of social allowance. It kept the system stable, in his view, even amidst the repression. He wasn't just annihilating everyone randomly, he was managing dissent, rewarding loyalty, and letting some steam escape through migration.
A chilling kind of pragmatism. Okay, so power consolidated, control established. Then comes the next massive chapter,
Right.
the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. Given they'd signed that Algiers agreement just 5 years earlier, what flipped? What drove him to invade Iran?
Several factors converged. Primarily, Saddam was deeply worried about Iran's Islamic Revolution, which had just overthrown the Shah. He feared it spreading to Iraq's own Shia majority population, who share religious ties with Iran.
And there was personal animosity, too, wasn't there, between Saddam and Ayatollah Khomeini?
Oh, bitter personal enmity. Saddam had actually expelled Khomeini from Iraq back in 1978 when Khomeini was in exile there. Plus, border skirmishes were already escalating, and Iran's Dawa Party, an Iraqi Shia Islamist group backed by Iran, had tried to assassinate Tariq Aziz, Saddam's deputy prime minister. It was a toxic mix. Geopolitics, sectarian fears, personal hatred.
So September 22, 1980, Iraq invades. Aiming for Khuzestan province, Iran's oil-rich region. How did the world react this time?
It's complicated. Saddam positioned himself as the defender of the Arab world against revolutionary fundamentalist Iran, and he got backing, financial backing from various Arab states, but also support, overt or covert, from the U.S. and Europe.
They saw him as the lesser evil compared to Khomeini's Iran.
Pretty much, the conflict turned into this horrifying war of attrition, one of the longest, most destructive wars of the 20th century. Casualty estimates are vast, somewhere between 1 and 2 million dead on both sides.
And during this war, Iraq used chemical weapons. That's confirmed, right?
Yes, extensively. Against Iranian forces, but also against Kurdish separatists within Iraq who had sided with Iran. Tariq Aziz later admitted it, though he claimed Iran used them first.
But the international reaction, it wasn't exactly condemnation, was it? Especially from the West.
Not strongly, no. In fact, the U.S. actually removed Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1982. Why? To make it easier to provide support against Iran, even though they knew about Iraq's continued links to terrorism.
Donald Rumsfeld famously met Saddam in 1983.
He did, and Iraq received significant military aid, not just from the U.S. indirectly, but also from the Soviet Union, France, China. It was also the time of the Iran-Contra affair, remember, where the U.S. was secretly selling arms to Iran, too. A very murky period.
Geopolitics trumping human rights, it seems, and one of the absolute worst moments was the Halabja massacre in 1988.
A horrific event. It was part of the Anfal campaign, Saddam's genocidal campaign against the Kurds. In Halabja, a Kurdish town that had cooperated with Iranian forces, the Iraqi military dropped chemical weapons, mustard gas, nerve agents.
Killing thousands of civilians.
Between 3,200 and 5,000 people, mostly civilians, died horribly. And what's really telling is how the narrative was handled initially. The U.S. State Department actually suggested Iran might bear some responsibility.
Seriously?
Yes. Though today, very few credible observers doubt that Iraq was solely responsible. It's a stark example of how immediate political goals can warp the telling of even horrific events.
Okay, so that brutal war finally ends in 1988. Basically a stalemate. You'd think Iraq and Saddam would need time to recover. But just 2 years later, 1990, he invades Kuwait. Why? Why turn on Kuwait, who'd actually helped fund his war against Iran?
Debt was a huge factor. Iraq came out of the Iran war owing about $90 billion. A huge chunk of that, around $40 billion, was owed to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam wanted the debt forgiven, they refused.
And he accused Kuwait of stealing Iraqi oil.
Yeah, through slant drilling under the border. Plus, there was this old historical claim that Kuwait was rightfully Iraq's 19th province, carved off by the British. And then there was this alleged personal insult.
The story about the Kuwaiti emir.
Right. The unverified but widely reported story that the emir insulted Iraqi women, threatening to turn them into prostitutes. Whether true or not, it fueled Saddam's narrative.
So August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi tanks roll into Kuwait. And the initial U.S. reaction was kind of ambiguous, wasn't it? The April Glaspie meeting.
That's right. The U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie, met Saddam shortly before the invasion. She reportedly told him the U.S. had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Saddam seems to have taken that as a green light, or at least not a red light.
A disastrous miscalculation, if so. He offered a deal later, right? Withdraw from Kuwait if Israel withdrew from occupied territory.
He did, trying to link the issues and gain Arab support, but the U.S.-led coalition rejected it outright.
And then came Operation Desert Storm.
Yep, January 1991, a massive air campaign followed by a ground assault. The Iraqi army, worn down by the previous war and facing overwhelming force, was quickly ejected from Kuwait.
Huge casualties for Iraq.
Massive. Around 175,000 taken prisoner, estimates of over 85,000 killed. A catastrophic military defeat.
But Saddam.
Saddam, true to form, went on Iraqi TV and declared victory. Claimed they had stood up to the world's superpowers. A masterclass in propaganda, perhaps, but completely detached from the reality on the ground.
So after the Gulf War, we enter the last phase of his rule. The 90s leading up to 2003. A tough period for Iraq.
Incredibly tough. Right after the war, there were major uprisings. Shia in the south, Kurds in the north, even parts of the military.
Which the U.S. had actually encouraged, hadn't they?
They had, via radio broadcasts, urging Iraqis to overthrow Saddam. But when the uprisings happened, the U.S. provided no support, and Saddam crushed them brutally. Estimates range from 100,000 to 180,000 killed in the repression.
And then came the sanctions.
Crippling UN sanctions.
Right.
Blocked oil exports, Iraq's main source of income. The GDP just plummeted. It went from over $44 billion in 1990 down to just $9 billion by 1995. Iraq lost potentially $170 billion in oil revenues over the decade.
And the sanctions hit ordinary people hard. Medical supplies, basic goods.
Severely. There was immense suffering. Eventually, in 1996, Saddam accepted the UN's Oil for Food program, which allowed Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil, specifically to buy food and medicine.
During this time, Saddam seemed to turn more towards religion, didn't he? The faith campaign.
He did, starting around 1993. It was likely an attempt to shore up support among religious conservatives and regain legitimacy. He added, Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, to the Iraqi flag in his own handwriting. He commissioned numerous mosques.
And the infamous Blood Quran.
Yes, reportedly commissioned by him and written using 27 liters of his own blood over 2 years. A very symbolic, if rather macabre, gesture linking himself directly to Islam.
Meanwhile, tensions with the U.S. just kept simmering. Airstrikes, accusations about WMDs.
Constant friction. The U.S. launched missile attacks periodically, maintained no-fly zones over parts of Iraq, and kept accusing Saddam of violating sanctions and secretly developing weapons of mass destruction.
And Saddam made a move against the U.S. dollar, too, right? Started trading oil in euros.
He did under the Oil for Food program, starting around 2001. He switched Iraq's oil exports to be priced and paid for in euros, not dollars. It channeled something like 26 billion euros, about $17.4 billion back then, into the escrow account.
That wasn't just a financial decision, was it? It was a political statement.
Absolutely. A direct challenge to the dollar's dominance in the global oil trade, and a clear signal of defiance against the U.S.
And throughout this period, his anti-Israel stance remained incredibly strong.
Unwavering. Constant pro-Palestinian rhetoric, threats to burn Israel. He provided significant financial support to Palestinian groups and families, reportedly around 20% of Iraq's oil revenue at times. In 2001, he famously declared, Palestine is Arab and must be liberated from the river to the sea.
He even cut off oil supplies briefly in 2002 to pressure Israel.
Yes, trying to use the oil weapon again during the Second Intifada. His opposition to Israel was a cornerstone of his regional policy and his image.
Which brings us to 2003 and the endgame, the U.S. invasion.
Right. President George W. Bush made the case for invasion based on two main pillars: Iraq possessing WMDs and having links to al-Qaeda, the group behind 9/11.
Claims which were later largely discredited.
Indeed. Investigations after the invasion found no stockpiles of WMDs and no operational links between Saddam's regime and al-Qaeda. Saddam himself denied having WMDs in a CBS interview just before the war. Interestingly, he later told an FBI interrogator after his capture that he had deliberately bluffed about WMDs.
Why? To deter Iran.
Exactly, to make Iran think Iraq still had them, to appear strong against his regional rival. A bluff with catastrophic consequences.
So the invasion began March 20, 2003, and the regime fell quickly.
Very quickly. Baghdad fell by early April. The iconic image is the toppling of Saddam's statue in Firdos Square on April 9th, symbolizing the collapse of his rule. But Saddam himself vanished.
He went into hiding, releasing audio tapes, trying to rally resistance.
For months, yes. Until December 13, 2003, he was finally captured.
Found hiding in a hole in the ground near Tikrit, his hometown.
That's right. A rather ignominious end to his time on the run. Reports from his captivity are quite interesting. During interrogation by FBI agent George Pirro, he apparently remained quite self-assured, defiant even.
His guards called him Vic, very important criminal.
Apparently so. He was allowed certain comforts, planting a small garden, smoking cigars, writing poetry. He seemed very concerned even then about his legacy.
Then came the trial, handed over to the interim Iraqi government in June 2004.
He was charged primarily with crimes against humanity related to the 1982 Dujail massacre, the killing of 148 Shia residents after an assassination attempt against him there.
The trial itself was complex, wasn't it? Chaotic at times.
Very much so. There were challenges with security, assassinations of defense lawyers, changes in judges. Saddam himself was often defiant in court.
But ultimately, he was found guilty.
On November 5, 2006, found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging.
He requested a firing squad, didn't he, as a military commander?
He did, but it was denied. He was executed on December 30th, 2006, which coincided with the start of the Eid-ul-Adha holiday, a significant date in the Islamic calendar. Reports say she died mid-sentence while reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith.
And the execution itself became controversial. The leaked mobile phone video.
Yes, showing guards taunting him in his final moments. There were also later reports, unconfirmed, about stab wounds found on his body, claimed by the head guard at his tomb. And witness accounts varied wildly. Some said he was strong and defiant to the end, others that he appeared afraid. It added another layer of controversy and conflicting narratives right up to his death.
Before we wrap up, maybe a word on his personal life, often overshadowed, but part of the picture.
Sure. His first wife was his cousin, Sajida Talfa. He later took a second wife, Samira Shabandar. He had 5 children. 2 sons, Uday and Kwase, and 3 daughters, Ragad, Rana, and Hala.
Uday and Kwase were seen as his likely successors, weren't they? But both had reputations.
Uday, the eldest, had a reputation for being erratic, violent, unpredictable. Kwase was seen as more stable, less flamboyant, and was likely the intended successor later on. Both were killed in a shootout with U.S. forces in Mosul in 2003, before their father's capture.
And his daughters. They've spoken about him since.
Yes, in interviews, Ragad and Rana described him as a very good father, loving, tender. A very different perspective, obviously, from the public image. We should also mention his sons-in-law, Hussein Kamal and Saddam Kamal, who defected in 1995, revealed secrets about weapons programs, but were later lured back and killed. And yes, he had lavish tastes. That diamond-coated Rolex he reportedly gifted allies is often mentioned.
So bringing it all together, his legacy, how do people see him now? It's incredibly divided, isn't it?
Absolutely polarizing. He promoted this idea of Saddamism, a mix of Iraqi nationalism and Pan-Arabism. He deliberately linked himself to historical figures like Saladin, Nebuchadnezzar, even stamping his name on bricks used to restore ancient Babylon, trying to create this image of himself as a great historical leader.
And in the wider Arab world.
Many Arabs still praise him, perhaps selectively remembering his defiance against the West, his opposition to Israel, his projection of Arab strength, however flawed. They see him as someone who stood up to perceived imperialism.
But within Iraq, especially among Kurds and Shia.
A very different view dominates. For them, he's overwhelmingly remembered as a brutal tyrant responsible for mass murder, torture, disappearances, the Anfal genocide, the suppression of uprisings, decades of trauma. His regime started secular, but embraced Islam more overtly later with the Faith Campaign, adding yet another layer to how he's viewed.
It really is such a complex picture. Development and destruction, reform and repression, all wrapped up in one figure.
Exactly. modernizing infrastructure, advancing women's rights in certain periods, but also waging horrific wars, crushing any dissent with unimaginable brutality. His actions truly left deep, lasting scars on Iraq and the entire region.
So the final thought for you, our listener. Given these incredibly conflicting perspectives, this tangled legacy of progress and brutality, how do you think history will ultimately judge Saddam Hussein? Especially as maybe new information comes out or perspectives shift over time, it's a question that probably doesn't have an easy answer.